Hello and welcome to Religious Studies 222 Contemporary Moral Problems. The title of the course is Systemic Change in the Era of Sustainability. My name is Scott Kelly. I work in the Office of Mission and Values and I'm an assistant professor in Religious Studies. The course is going to cover the notion of systemic change in the era of sustainability. So the first thing we have to discuss is what we mean by the era of sustainability. And it's a pretty straightforward equation. As you can see on the graph on the left, the human population is projected to plateau sometime around 2100, between 8 and 10 billion people. And most of that growth is going to come from what has traditionally been called developing countries that are beginning to consume more and more resources. And you'll see on the image on the right, if the developing world follows the same patterns of consumption as the United States, we're going to be in big trouble. We're going to need 3 to 5 planets, and that's just simply not an option. The sustainability challenges that we face are captured by a pretty straightforward equation that some of you may be familiar with. I equals PAT. Environmental impact is a function of the human population times affluence or economic growth times technology. Now, some have said that this is kind of a dire circumstance, and it certainly is severe. But it's also an opportunity to rethink what human flourishing means. And it's important to remember that this is not simply a moral obligation or merely a moral obligation to do the right thing. This is also a creative opportunity to address many of the problems that we agree are problematic. What must be done is referred to as the Vincentian question. So Vincent de Paul had a very wealthy patron, Madame de Gondi, and they had both encountered a dying peasant. Vincent de Paul heard his confession shortly before he died, and Madame de Gondi turned to Vincent de Paul and said, "What must be done?" And by that she meant, what must you do, what must I do, what must we do to address the horrific conditions that we have just witnessed. So when we talk about systemic change, it's really a response to this Vincentian question, what must be done? We're going to use a method called Vincentian pragmatism, or pragmatic inquiry. I'm going to ask you to read an article that frames the method that we're going to be using so that you understand what we're doing while we're doing it. But this method is not new. It's been used in a number of different venues. Most recently, it was used at the UN's Rio Plus 20 summit in Rio de Janeiro. It's been used at a number of universities and their business schools and nonprofits and for-profits. The challenge for us with sustainability is that much of the conversation focuses on tactics. Recycling, for example, is a tactic. But beyond that, we don't often get to the level of strategy, and we rarely get to the level of vision. And it's important to note that vision is the driver of strategy, and strategy the driver of tactics. So we're going to examine this vision and values level as we proceed through the course. This is the method that we're going to be using. On the outside, See, Judge, Act is a method of Catholic social action, and we're going to develop that into 5 areas of intentional practice. Begin attentively, explore openly, interpret imaginatively, decide responsibly, and act courageously. So to begin, in this begin attentively phase, there are two components. One is to establish a baseline, and we're going to return to this baseline throughout the quarter, and particularly at the end, to see how our thinking has changed. And the second part of this is keeping an ongoing log or journal of different insights that you have along the way. It's important to see how these things grow over time. The 5 baseline questions, as you'll see in D2L and Digication, that I'll explain in a later screencast, ask you to consider 5 things. The first, what social need, problem, issue, or opportunity would you like to address? Second question, which we'll call the challenge question, or CQ, is what is the barrier to that, addressing that need? The third one, what's your hypothesis? Every question has some sense of an answer, and it's important to articulate that at the beginning. Fourth, what are the values and vision impacting your answer? And fifth, what have you done about this, or what are you doing now, or what would you like to do in the future about it? So all 5 of these questions constitute the baseline. If you look at this sketch, it looks kind of random, just a bunch of scribbles. But this eventually evolved into the Vitruvian Man. So it's important to note that a lot of great thinkers did not arrive at their big insight in one single moment. It was a series of things that led to that, and there are many, many iterations of things that fail before there is one that is successful. So you can see from here, looks like a sketchbook, a kid's sketchbook, and this is Picasso's work. You probably recognize this one. This is Edison, and I believe it took 1,000 iterations of this drawing before he arrived at a light bulb that worked. This looks like total chicken scratch, but as we see, it's not. This is the work of Beethoven. And this also looks like just a random set of scribbles or thoughts just jotted down. And this is the diaries of Kurt Cobain. You might not recognize this one at first, but if you notice, if you look closely, you'll see that this is the very origins of Darwin's notion of evolution, the origin of species. And this was in his sketchbook. So as you progress in your core challenge, I just ask that you keep a journal or a log or something. I'm not going to collect this, but it's important for you to understand how your thinking is changing over time. We talked about the 5 baseline questions already. These are going to go in the Digication e-portfolio. As you can see, the tabs on the top match the 5 steps of pragmatic inquiry that I'll get to in a minute. Now, this is a religious studies course, so we want to understand how how religion and religious worldview influences and impacts the challenge question that we've identified. So as Bernard Lonergan argues, if one does not attain on the level of one's age an understanding of the religious realities in which one believes, one will be simply at the mercy of the psychologists, the sociologists, the philosophers that will not hesitate to tell the believers what it really is in which they believe. This is an important point. We all have a worldview, and that worldview is operative in our thinking, our believing, our decisions. So the question is not whether we have a worldview or not, but is that worldview, are we conscious of it, and are we choosing it intentionally? So this is the goal, to make our worldview conscious and intentional. Some key concepts that we'll cover later in the quarter. Human dignity in Catholic social thought is the belief that all humans have dignity because they were created by God. And because of that belief, there is a notion of human development, of integral human development, that has 4 different dimensions. We'll read the Barrera article later on, but here are 4 key concepts. That we have enough material goods to survive, that we are able to exercise our moral agency, that our aim is not merely for survival, but for flourishing and happiness, and the vision of integral human development must include everyone. In the Explore Openly phase, we're going to ask you to take different perspectives and broader perspectives, greater perspectives. And in this process, hopefully you'll allow new evidence in your research to challenge your assumptions. And these are the different perspectives we're going to take. We're going to begin with the market, and by market we mean a set of needs that is connected to your challenge question. So this is a concept from the business community, but it's helpful for all sectors of society. What is the market that constitutes your challenge question, or the markets? Then we're going to analyze a single organization that attempts to meet the needs of that market. We want to understand the organization's mission statement, its budget, its the metrics it uses to measure success, and all of those functions of an organization. We're going to examine how those organizations meet market needs. Another way of looking at that is a basic exchange relationship of supply and demand. Think of market as a set of demands. So whether you're covering homelessness or hunger or food deserts, climate change, whatever the case is, we're going to examine this from the demand side, the market side, and the supply side as well. All of this is embedded within a social, cultural, religious context, and all of that is embedded within a finite environment. The social perspective that we're going to take is really a sector perspective. There are 4 sectors that we'll talk about: the government sector, the for-profit or corporate sector, the nonprofit sector, and the household sector. All of those in some way or another will impact your challenge question. So here's kind of a grid that we'll cover in more detail later. Each of those sectors has a particular structure, a set of responsibilities, and a set of constraints. They all operate with limited resources, and it's important to understand that so that we can hone our expectations and our vision of a possible solution. And all of this is embedded within a finite ecology. And by that I mean there are fixed natural resources. Some are renewable, but many are not. And if we exhaust those resources beyond their capacity to regenerate, then we begin on the long slope towards decline and deterioration. So the environmental challenges, as I mentioned before, if we think of the growing population, take for example the massive population growth in India and China. India now has a middle class that's bigger than the entire population of the United States. And if all of those people in the Indian middle class choose to buy cars or develop 24-hour fitness centers and take escalators up rather than taking the stairs, think of the energy inputs, the material inputs that go towards building those things, the carbon emissions into the atmosphere. And we begin to understand that we live on one planet and these resources are not infinite. Another way of thinking about our environmental challenges is that we have to be cautious of the concentrations of things that we extract from the earth. We have to be cautious of the things we put back into the earth, toxins that don't biodegrade very easily. degradation of renewable resources, so when we clear cut forests, for example. And all of those factors have to address the gross inequality that exists on a global scale. So this all comes from the natural step, but it's another way of getting at some of those environmental challenges that we'll explore later. The next phase is to interpret the data that we have found through our research and to put it into a coherent system. So I'll explain this later, but this is a map of Afghanistan created by General David Petraeus. And if it looks complicated, well, the reality on the ground is complicated. So you'll see all of these, the private sector, the public sector, the nonprofit sector, popular opinion, all of this is a very extraordinarily complicated system. And I'm going to ask you to do your own systems mapping of the challenge question so that you begin to understand all of those things that are impacting it and influencing it. And the method, as I've said before, begin, explore, interpret, decide, act. In the decide phase, we're going to ask you to make a proposal for a systemic change project. And you'll need to identify the audience, how you want to intervene in these complex systems, and what specifically you intend to do. And lastly, the act courageously phase, which is the final homework assignment after you've submitted all of your work, which is to go do it, to go out into the world and intervene in a system. And address your challenge question. So this is not just an intellectual exercise. This is an exercise to clarify potential actions. And that is an overview of the course. And there are other screencasts that get into the nuts and bolts.